Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and this is a kind of a special edition of one of my reading series. Today, I'm going to be looking at the preface of the second edition and the first chapter of Carl Schmitt's Political Theology. Now, I'm on vacation, not on vacation, but Easter break and things like this. But I wanted to just do these special kind of like a special, and this one and maybe one more maybe for Thursday and Muddy Thursday and Good Friday, right? But we'll see. We'll see what happens. Today, I'm focusing on the Schmidt's classic 1922 edition of a book called Political Theology, where he spells out the thrust of what I would say the beginning point of his new kind of change in political thinking. Schmitt was primarily a legal thinker, following in the concept of Staatsrecht, um, uh, which is the idea of state law, state theory, which is the basis of German constitutional administrative law. Um, the nature, I mean, his famous books in the 1920s was his famous book Staatsrecht, which Novera ceased, which I totally mispronouncing. I know my German is verbal German is horrible, um, but it would be translated by the American translator as constitutional theory. Um, I might go over that. It's a very long book, but it'd be worth looking at. But today we're just looking at the preface to his preface and the first chapter of his classic work, Political Theology. So let's turn to it. What he says here. This is Schmitt in 1934 doing a second edition of it. And this is just after, I think he revising after the book, his 1932 book, Concept of the Political, if I remember correctly, the dates. I sometimes forgets the dates. Now, so let's look at this, right? The second edition of Political Theology remains unchanged. In other words, after 12 years, one can judge to what extent this short publication, which appeared in March 22, has withstood the test of time. The disputes within liberal normativism and the kind of constitutional state are repeated verbatim. Few cuts that have been made involve a passage that dealt with non-essentials. Now, he doesn't explain what it is. I think it's available. Some people argue that this was a Jewish reference and things like that. And given it was 34 after the rise of Nazis and his, embracement, he wanted it to kind of hide some things he was being friendly towards. Right, there's the footnote here. And this is the Schwab translation modified by, uh, oh come on, Terence Terry Strong. Um, what and published originally by MIT in the 1980s, and then republished by University of Chicago, edited by Strong. So, second paragraph. What has become clear in recent years are the numerous additional instances to which the idea of political theology is applicable. Now, political theology is this concept of the idea of theological concepts in the political dimension. Okay, so this is what political theology is, and the argument of the taking of theological concepts of particularly the power of God, and then using them as a political reference. Okay, so let's continue the paragraph. Representation from the 15th to the 19th century. The 17th century monarchy, which is regarded as the god of the Baroque philosophy. The neutral power of the 19th century, which reigned uh, but did not rule, up to the conceptions of the pure measure and the administrative state, which administers but does not rule, are examples of the fruitfulness of the thought process of political theology. In other words, his basic thrust is that all the concepts that we deal, like he says, the Baroque, the idea of the monarchy. Now this is tied to Ernst Konontovich's classic work, um, um, The King's Two Bodies, right? This concept of the King's Two Bodies. The medieval theology tied with Augustinian conceptions of that, and plus the body of Christ, became a very important metaphor to justify and understand the royal authority, right? This is that, and therefore he talks about in other words, the 17th century monarchy, right? And then he talks about the God of Baroque philosophy. That is the idea of the sovereign God, right? And then where he, the idea that he reigned but did not rule, and that is up to the concepts of the administrative state, which is 19th century, late 19th century, early things. Again, all these concepts that emerge, concepts of sovereignty, concepts uh, 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 of how I say reigning contra ruling, right? All of these are what he says as the origins of comes from political theology or theological constructs. So I continue. The major problems concerning the individual stage, the process of secularization from the theological stage by the way of the metaphysical to the ethical and the economic stages will rest in my address neutralization and depoliticization delivered in Barcelona on October 1929. So his whole part is this concept of secularization, the whole process of to understand the whole process of the development of the state. This is a product of the overall secularization of theological concepts, he argues, right? From these stages, from the theological to the metaphysical to the ethical to the economic, right? And this it gives you the stages of development. He treats this in his address, the age of naturalization, depoliticization. Now he says among Protestant theologians, Henrik Forshoff and Frederick Gogarten, in particular, have shown what without a concept of secularization, we cannot understand our history of the last century. So therefore, the 19th century. Talking about. To be sure, Protestant theology presents a different, supposedly unpolitical doctrine, conceiving of God as the holy other, just as the political liberalism of the state and politics are conceived to be the holy other. In other words, this idea of the Protestant theology. Now, remember, Schmitt's a Catholic and sought to kind of understand, the political understanding of political Catholicism in his 1919 work. The Roman Catholic Church as a political form. Schmitt's understanding here is very interesting in the sense that his political theology, the argument of Protestant theology of the God who is other, right? Coming from Judaism, this is a little bit of hinting at this Protestant is really also Judaic, right? The God who is other, the God is completely separate from the nature of being, right? To be sure, Protestant, he says, holy other, and therefore the state is what? Holy other. The state, in other words, liberals, the political liberalism of the state and politics are conceived as holy other. We have come to recognize that the political is the total, and as a result, in other words, the political is the total. It's complete. It's the complete thing. In this sense, it has no reign of this. It overcomes over all, and as a result, we know that any decision about whether something is unpolitical is always a political decision, irrespective of who decides and what reason is advanced. So something, in other words, the question of what is political and what is not political is a political decision, regardless of who's doing it. Therefore, the person who is making that decision is engaging in politics, Schmitt argues. Okay, regardless of and what reasons are advanced. This also holds for the question of whether a particular theology is a political or unpolitical theology. Okay. I would like to supplement my remarks on Hobbes concerning the two types of juristic thinking found at the end of the second chapter, right? The second chapter of the book he talks here. It is vital because it concerns me professionally as a professor of law. I now distinguish not between two, but three types of legal thinking. This is his, in other words, his change that he makes, right? This idea of three thinking, three judicial thinkings, and that's available. It's a separate publication article of this. In addition to the normativist and decision types, right? To normativist and decision, there is an institutional one. So there's a normativist norms that are applied into it. The normativist, the decisionist is the idea. He'll talk about this then. And the next kind is the institutional one. And I have come to this conclusion as a result of a discussion of my notion of institutional guarantees in German jurisprudence and my own study of the profound meaningfulness theory of institutions formulated by Maurice Haru, Haru. Whereas the pure normativist thinks in terms of interpersonal rules, and the tradition that implements the good law by the Corredi recognize the political Corredi recognize political situation by means of a personal decision. Institutional thinking unfolds in institutions and organizations that transcends the personal sphere. Whereas the normativist in distortion makes law a mere mode of operation of the state bureaucracy. The decisionist, focusing on the moment, always runs the risk of missing the stable content inherent in every great political movement. And isolated institutional thinking leads to pluralism, characteristics of the feudal corporate growth that is devoid of sovereignty. This three spheres and elements of political unity: the state, the movement, and the people. Now, this is going to be important because he will name an article about this. This is this is very much in his Nazi writings, because the problem here is the Nazis and all totalitarian ideologies. What's important is the movement, the party, right? The party and the movement, and that the party captures the state. In other words, it's the party state for a reason. But this is the party captures the state. Here he gives state and then the people. The people, the Volk, right? In other words, the three spheres and the three elements: the state, the movement, and the people, the Volk. Thus, may be joined to the three juristic thinkings. In other words, this is what normativist. Uh, 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 Decisionist and institutionalist, right? This is what we would suggest here, in their healthy as well as the distorted forms, not resting on natural right or the laws of reason. In other words, not resting on natural right and laws of reason, merely attached to factually valid norms. The German theory of public law of the Wilhelmine and Weimar period, with its so-called positivism and normativism, was only deteriorated and therefore self-contradictory normativism. So therefore, he's criticizing this as being a kind of a defective normativism, blended with a specific kind of positivism. It was merely a degenerated decisionism. Okay, blind to the law, clinging to the normative power of the factual, and not to a genuine decision. This formless mixture, unsuitable for any structure, was no match for any serious problem concerning state and constitution. This last epoch of German law is characterized by the fact that the answer to one decisive case has remained outstanding, namely the Prussian constitutional conflict with Bismarck. This is the Prussian conflict with Bismarck, the Bismarckian structure of this the constitutional law, um, and and as a result, we lack answers to all decisive cases. Now, to evade the necessary decision, German public law coined for such cases a saying that backfired and that it still carries as the motto. Here is where public law stops. The famous idea. In other words, the distinguish between what is possible by law, what public law can solve, and what is purely an act of political will. Right. This is the famous problem of um, the Prussian order, the Bismarckian situation. What law could achieve and what then was outside the scope of law was and dictated by force, or dictated by the active will of the crown or the political system. Um, so here, in other words, he ends this introduction here explaining the framework of what he did in political theology to what is going to do later in the 1930s, when he is now within those naughty boys, right? Those bad Germans, naughty Germans. So let's look at this concept here right directly, right? The opening of chapter 1. Okay, this takes the whole thing of the chapter 1 day. He opens up with his famous line, "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception." This is the concept. What is the exception? The exception, okay, we have to understand the difference between the exception and the norm. The norm is the typical behavior, the routinized, typical behavior that we always would think, the outcome that we always would have. In the process of something, the norm is what always occurs in the process in that sense. The exception is the outlier, or the case of when the norm doesn't hold. The normal outcomes, the normal thing doesn't hold. The exception is the crisis, the concept of a crisis, where the normal rules do not apply, or the normal procedure just doesn't produce the results. This is the concept of the exception. The exception for Schmitt is the most important element. In other words, it's outside the process. In other words, it's a situation where the law itself cannot resolve it. The nature of law itself and the legal processes of law administration, there simply don't have any. There's no satisfactory answer, and that cannot satisfactory. Now this goes back all the way to Aristotle's Book 3 in the discussion of the problem of law and discussion of the rule of law versus the Pambasileia in chapters 15, 16, and 17 of Book 3 of the Aristotle's Politics. This is a big important question. The question of what law is always tied to the functionality of a regime, and law always operates a general principle. The law always speaks of the general situation, the ordinary situation, the typical situation. It does not speak to specific circumstances. Usually, that requires a command or a decree or something like that. A ruler has to make a specific decision and decree. Law tends to always operate at the general, to unify, it's equal, it applies to all, where a decree may deal with a specific issue. And the exception is like this. The exception is something where the normal situation of normal process of law itself just does not work. The law itself has no satisfactory answer, cannot resolve. And in this situation, the crisis happens because the law cannot resolve the routinization of law. This idea of law itself doesn't offer an answer, and therefore it requires the state to make, or the ruler, the sovereign, to make a decision, and that's why, therefore, to resolve this, right? So that's why the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. Only this definition can do justice to a borderline concept. So there's an argument, this idea of sovereignty, the exception must be the borderline concept, contrary to the imprecise terminology that is found in popular literature. A borderline concept is not a vague concept, but one pertaining to the outermost sphere. So therefore, it's something at the extreme edge, or the outermost sphere, the outline. A borderline concept, it's at the edge. It's not within the frame of something or to the heart of the matter, but at the outlines of it. As before, the concept kind of it goes beyond the concept, right? This definition of sovereignty must therefore be associated with the borderline case and not with the routine. Okay, so therefore the question is the borderline case, not the routine. Sovereign's routine is going to always end up becoming the law, right, or administration. It will soon become clear that the exception is to be understood to refer to a general concept of the theory of the state, and not merely to a construct applied to any emergency decree or state of siege. In other words, it's this idea of the exception is not simply understood as in terms of what he says, a emergency decree or a state of siege, the state of war, right? This condition, but rather it is tied to the general theory of the state itself. Okay. In other words, it's a general concept in the theory of the state. In other words, this idea that there is this idea that's the scope of law and the scope of things deal with the norm, and that things that really are outside the scope of which the law can do satisfactory, this is where the exception comes up. This is how he understands this. In other words, this is not, in one sense, this is not existential in that at one level. It's very much coming out of looking at judicial thinking and the difference between a judicial thinking and a decision. And therefore, he wants this. There's one argument: if you understand the exception as state of emergency, you're limiting the concept of what the exception is. Okay, the exception doesn't only happen at extreme situations; it happens any time that the law cannot satisfy. This is this is the mistake that I think Agamben and that type, when they read the exception here, they understand this as kind of extraordinary condition. It's not extraordinary. It is it is, in other words, it's not extraordinary in terms of crisis, or but rather the limitation of what the norm can be, or what the limitation of law can be. The routinization of law can be, in that sense. This is kind of an attack on positivism in that sense, because positivism understands that law can be so always routinized. You see this in Kant. You see this even though you can say, oh, he's not a positivist, but Kant routinizes law. He doesn't like decision. He wants he wants this political structure and the thing structure to always have law, and you can see this even in the works, and you see this in the Neo-Kantian tradition of law. This triumph of legislative power, this type of the lawmaking power. The law must operate. Everything must be under the law. And what this does, and the limit here is that the law can't. There's going to be situations where the law, because the law speaks in general principles, cannot address, and it's gonna fail on. And this is what Schmitt is kind of pointing to. This is his critique. The assertion that the exception is truly appropriate for the juristic definition of sovereignty has a systemic legal logical foundation. The decision is based on the decision on the exception is a decision in the true sense of the word, because a general norm, as represented by ordinary legal prescription, can never encompass a total exemption. In other words, a decision that a real exception exists and cannot be entirely derived from a norm. When Robert von Mohr said that the test of whether a emergency exists cannot be a juristic one by a juristic concept, he assumed that a decision in the legal sense must be derived entirely from the context of the norm. Okay, the norm, in other words, to understand what is the decision, must come from norm. What is the norm here? What is the general principle here that's applying here? And whether does it mean, in other words, whether this emergency state exists must derive from the norm. But this is the question. In the general sense in which Mohr actualized his argument, the notion is only an expression of constitutional liberalism and fails to apprehend the independent meaning of the decision. In other words, he's saying it comes out of this idea of that the norm is going to dominate. The norm or the principle is always going to do it. Therefore, the principle or the norm is going to decide whether this is an exception or not. And therefore, this imposes on the phenomena or the thing it imposes what we can say a kind of framework that is external to the issue, right? That's, I think, what he's saying here. Now he has a note here. You can always read the note separately. In other words, expression of constitutional limit fails to apprehend the independent meaning of the decision from a practical or a theoretical perspective. From a practical or theoretical perspective, so pro-practical and theoretical, it really does not matter whether an abstract scheme advanced to define sovereignty, namely that sovereignty is the highest power, not a derived power, is acceptable. So, in other words, this idea whether this is that or this one, this is, in other words, it's whether this scheme is acceptable. About an abstract concept, there will, in general, be no argument. At least least of all in the history of sovereignty. What is argued about is the concrete application, and what and that means who decides in a situation of conflict what constitutes the public interest or the interest of the state, public safety and order, le statut, la statut public, and so on. In other words, who decides these things? Who is the decision making decides this? The exception, which there is no codification in the existing legal order, can at best be characterized as a case of extreme peril, a danger to the existence of the state and the like, but it cannot be circumscribed factually and made to conform to a performed law. Performed law. In other words, you cannot. In other words, you cannot routinize it in law. You're saying in other words, the exception is something that fundamentally threatens the existence of the state. It is a threat to the public safety, the public interest, to such a degree that, and that the law, the routinization of law itself, cannot. In other words, the law and the norms are not able to satisfactorily address it. Now, this equals to, in some ways, this equals to the problem in Locke of both what Locke understood. Locke's and second treatise would talk about as prerogative, right? The prerogative power, the question of prerogative power, or federal power when it deals with other states, right? In Locke's second treatise, which I've talked about separately. So let's go think about that for a second. That therefore, Schmitt here is actually very much concerned with this concept of the exception is really fundamentally addressing what Locke and the tradition would argue as the concept of prerogative power, right? Which again tied to the sovereign. It is tied to the sovereign in this sense. The sovereign is the one who exercises this, and this is outside the scope of how the norm of the rules and even the constitutional framework of that establishes the institutions and the legal, the legislative structure, and these things often that this it being done, it being addressed, it being necessary to address, secures and maintains the proper legal structure of what's there. In other words, the constitutional structure. In other words, the exception is something extra constitutional in that sense. The constitutional frame it is that which makes possible the constitutional order or the political order. Okay, and I think this is what Schmitt is trying to get to. This is why it's so essential. Without it, the constitutional order or the constitution or the political order simply just cannot be. It's threatened. Its existence is threatened. It is precisely the exception that makes relevant the subject of sovereignty. That is the whole question of sovereignty. So the idea of the exception, he argues, raises, in other words, makes relevant sovereignty, and that is the whole question of sovereignty. The precise details of an emergency cannot be anticipated, nor can one spell out what may take place in such a case, especially when it is truly a matter of extreme emergency, and how it can be eliminated, and how it can be eliminated. Again, this very much is tied to federative power and prerogative, or a prerogative, what Locke would speak of as prerogative in the second treatise. The preconditions, as well as the context of judicial jurisdictional, sorry, not judicial, context of jurisdictional competence in the case, in such a case, must necessarily be unlimited. In other words, jurisdictional competence applies to institutional constitution. Who has jurisdiction? Different entities like police forces. There's concept of jurisdiction. You only have authority to act. Jurisdiction means what? Having the proper authority to act. That therefore, the jurisdiction is a defined scope of authority, defined scope of power. It's where you can exercise your power. Okay, and that most constitutional and most normative structures seeks to impose jurisdiction on things, to limit them. Right. That's the whole point. Jurisdictional competence is a mechanism of limiting or separating and dividing authority. So the famous argument that jurisdiction is also one of competence to make sure you don't overcompensate. But here, the concept of exception, must be unlimited in that sense. It's because it deals with the whole. It deals with the whole body politic per se, and that therefore it is unlimited in that sense, and not limited to a jurisdiction in that sense. This is why we have to understand the Roman concept of dictatorship, because I think the dictator in Rome also is this concept of emergency. This is the Roman legal institutional framework to deal with the problem of what we would say is the exception, right? That the constitutional, the normal procedure of the constitution of the Republic could not answer it. The normal functioning of the councils, the normal functioning of the Senate, all of this, the normal routine is not enough to address or to satisfy, to address this threat to the public safety. Okay, that the Senate would authorize the dictator, would have absolute authority, no limit, no power, no limit. His only limit was that the duration of the crisis, right? And that was defined by usually a set of time or the end of the crisis itself. And then powers revert to normal, right? That's the whole concept. The precise details of the emergency cannot be anticipated, nor can one spell out what may take place in such a case, especially when it truly is a matter of extreme emergency and how it is to be eliminated. The preconditions as well as the context of judicial competence in such a case must necessarily be unlimited. From the liberal constitutional point of view, there would be no jurisdictional competence at all. In other words, it has no jurisdictional competence at all. From a liberal constitutional point of view, there would be no jurisdictional competence at all. For most guidance, the most guidance the Constitution can provide is to indicate who can act in such cases, right? That's what the Constitution expresses: who acts, who can act. It specifies specifically. And therefore, this is why it's extra constitutional. This is why prerogative powers are often extra constitutional, outside of the scope of the Constitution. Why? Because the Constitutions normally, what they do is they define and specify and give jurisdiction. This is the nature of this argument. So if such action is not subject to controls, if it is not hampered in some way by checks and balances, as is the case in a liberal constitution, then it is clear who the sovereign is. In other words, if it's the sovereign is one who is not pertained by limits and checks. And that's what's always interesting. That in the American Constitution, we understand it's the people. The people collectively is. But the Constitution does what? It then grants. It doesn't. What it does is the people establish the Constitution, and the Constitution then establishes what? Establishes the institutions. It establishes for the federal Constitution. It establishes the bodies, the presidency, which is all sovereign executive power is vested in it. The legislative power of that, judicial power is granted to the courts, right? It's interesting that the American one only. The Constitution only creates a Supreme Court, and all inferior courts are created by the legislature, right? The legislative power is very extreme in that sense in the American Constitution. It grants more power. Again, being this English tradition, this legislative power emerges as the most supreme power in that sense. But what is reserved to prerogative is often left to the executive, right? So that's even more interesting. That therefore the extra constitutional authority may also be vested in all three branches in the American concept, right? This is the whole point about it, right? In other words, he now talks about it. He says that such an action is the liberal Constitution is clear. Who is in other words, it's not limited. This idea of the exception of who controls it, and it must be unlimited, right? Is not to be hampered by checks and balances, which is typical of the liberal Constitution. It's clear who the exception. He decides whether there is an extreme emergency, as well as what must be done to eliminate it. Although he stands outside the normal, valid legal system, he nevertheless belongs to it. For it is he who must decide whether the Constitution needs to be suspended in its entirety. Right? This idea. This idea. Now, I'm gonna. This is Locke. This is Locke's prerogative. I'm sorry. This is consistent with Locke's conception of prerogative power here. So let's not have any foolishness about this. All tendencies of modern constitutional development points towards eliminating the sovereign in this sense. And it's not true. All modern tendencies, from Kant onwards. He points to these German thinkers, the ideas of Hugo Krebs and Hans Kelsen, which will be treated in the following chapter, are in line with this development. But whether the extreme exception can be banished from the world is not a juristic question. In other words, that this issue, a juristic issue is okay. How does the law, how does the Constitution, how does the law address this issue? How does the law, how does the legal instruments of law address the issue of making this issue? In other words, the question about whether the can you what that what is it that exceptions can be banished from the world. This is not the scope of a juristic question in a sense. Whether one has confidence and hope that it can be eliminated depends on philosophical and especially philosophic, historical, and metaphysical convictions. So therefore, it's not a juristic aspect. It's not a question of pure law. Okay, this is the whole thing. This is the language of the Neo-Kantians and even people like Kelsen and Krebs. Is that the idea of pure law, right? Kelsen's famous thing is pure law, right? The problem here is that no, this is outside the scope of this. It's a philosophical issue. In other words, this is the problem with the so-called positivists who seek to want to get beyond metaphysical issues or philosophical, historical metaphysics or convictions. They want to get back to law, pure law without this metaphysical stuff, right? And this Schmitt is saying, no, you can't, no, sorry, no, you can't do that. This is just this is a wish on your part. It's a wish that you do this. It's not the reality. This question, whether one has confidence and hope that it can be eliminated, is a philosophical or a metaphysical concept, not a law. It is not dictated by juristic understanding in itself. There exists a number of historical presentations that deal with the development of the concept of sovereignty, but they're like textbook compilations of abstract formulas from which definitions of sovereignty can be extracted. So therefore, in other words, there are this development of the concept, but they're like textbook. They're kind of formalistic, and therefore these definitions can be extracted. Nobody seems to have taken the trouble to scrutinize the often repeated but completely empty phraseology used to denote the highest power of the famous authors of the concept of sovereignty. In other words, no one has bothered to really pay attention to the logic and structure of this, he says. That the concepts relate to the critical case, the exception, was long ago recognized by Jean Baudin. He stands at the beginning of the modern theory of the state because of his work on the true marks of sovereignty. Chapter 10 of the first book of his 10 books of the Republic, right? Chapter 10 of the first book of his 10 books on the Republic. This is Baudin's classic test where the concept of sovereignty merges, right? Rather than because of his off-cited definition, sovereignty is the absolute and perpetual power of the Republic, Respublica, right? This is it's not that. In other words, he stands at the beginning of this theory because of his work on this chapter, rather than because of his famous definition. He discussed his concept in the context of the many practical examples, and he always returned to the question: to what extent is the sovereign bound to law, and to what extent is he responsible to the estates? In other words, that's the big question that Baudin deals with in that chapter. Who is he responsible to? Is he responsible to the law, or is he responsible to the estates? To this last all-important question, he replied that the commitments are binding because they rest on natural law. In other words, that the commitments are binding because they rest on natural law. But in emergency, the ties to general natural principles cease. So right, this is that point here. That therefore, this idea that in norm, the natural law rests in the commitments of this. But in emergencies, the tie to general natural principles cease. In general, according to him, the prince is duty bound towards the estates or the people only to the extent of fulfilling his promise in the interest of the people. He is not so bound under conclusions of urgent necessity. In other words, urgent necessity. In other words, he's bound to the estates or the people only to the extent of fulfilling his promise, and in the interest of the people. He is by not, he, but he is not so bound under conditions of urgent necessity. These are by no means new theses. The decisive point about Bodin's concept is that, referring to the emergency, he reduced his analysis of the relationship between the prince to estates to a simple either or, right? Either these or that, either this or that, right? Either the estates or the people, either the estates. Again, this note 3 talks about to his famous book on dictatorship that was earlier, right? I'm going to skip that. I'm going to turn here to the next part. Again, I'm sorry, I'm using what's available through my EPUB through here, and the notes are really off. I'm sorry for that. But this is what is truly impressive in his definition of sovereignty, right? Bodin's sovereignty, that Schmitt is saying. By considering sovereignty to be indivisible, he finally settled the question of the power of the state. His scholarly accomplishment and the basis of his success thus resides in his having incorporated the decision, who decides, the either or, right, into the concept of sovereignty. Today, there is hardly any mention of the concept of sovereignty that does not contain the usual quotation from Bodin. But nowhere does one find cited the core quote from that chapter in the Republic, which is the name of the 6 books of the Republic, right? Bodin asked if the commitments of the prince to the estate or the people dissolve his sovereignty. He answered by referring to the case in which it becomes necessary to violate such commitments, to change laws, or to suspend them entirely according to the requirements of a situation, a time, and a people, right? To requirements of a situation, a time, and a people. If in such cases the prince had to consult a senate or the people before he could act, he would have to be prepared to let his subjects dispense with him. Okay. Bodin considered this an absurdity because, according to him, the estates were not the masters over the law. They, in turn, would have to permit their prince to dispense with them. Sovereignty would thus become a play between two parties. Sometimes the people, sometimes the prince would rule, and that would be contrary to all reason and all law. In other words, because the authority to suspend valid law, to be in general or in specific cases, this idea, be it in general or specific cases, who has the authority to suspend valid law, be it general law or specific cases, is so much an actual mark of sovereignty. Bodin wanted to derive from this authority from all other characteristics: declaring war and making peace, appointing civil servants, rights of pardons, final appeal, and so on. In other words, he wants to derive this authority over all characteristics, right? He wanted to derive this characteristic. Who is the ultimate decision to, in other words, recognize that whether this law is, I'm going to suspend this law. I'm not going to, I have to, in order to preserve the state and preserve the thing, I'm going to ignore the specific and general, in other words, this question to suspend the law. In contrast to traditional presentations, I have shown in my study in dictatorship that even the 17th century authors of natural law understood the question of sovereignty to mean the question of decision on the exception, right? This is particularly true of Samuel Pufendorf. Everyone agrees that whenever antagonism appears within a state, every party wants the general good. Therein resides, after all, the bellum onum contra armis. This idea of the war of all against all, right? This is the famous Hobbesian line. Resides, after all, the war. This is when every party wants the general good. Every party within the state wants this is the war. But sovereignty, and thus the state itself, resides in deciding this controversy, right? Right from Hobbes, right? Hobbes's reformulation of it. That is, determining the definitely what constitutes public order and security, and determining when they are disturbed, and so on. Public order and security manifest themselves very differently in reality, depending on whether a mere militaristic bureaucracy, a self-governing body controlled by the spirit of commercialism, or a radical party organization decides whether there is order and security, and when it is threatened or disturbed. So therefore, he's going to be saying that that it's going to vary. In other words, it's yes, in logic, simple, that the state is the body that is going to be determining, the sovereign is going to be the one who's going to be determining whether this public safety is being threatened, right? So therefore, this idea is that they're determining what constitutes the public order and security, and when it is being disturbed, and so on. But what is the public order and the security itself is going to be will manifest as differently in reality, based on the body who's exercising it. Be it a military bureaucracy, right? He says a self-governing body controlled by the spirit of commercialism, right? Or a radical party organization, the party, like the party, right? The party, be it the Nazis or the communists, right? An ideological party. They're going to decide when there is order and security and when it's threatened and disturbed. After all, every legal order is based on a decision. This is a very point. In other words, this goes right from Aristotle, that the law is relative to the regime. The nature of law is always going to be the kind of law you have, the kind of laws you have, will always reflect the view of justice inherent in the regime. It's going to embody what the regime believes is valid and just, and what is valid and just. Okay, the regimes are going to, all the different types of regimes, the political order is going to have different understandings of what is just, what is right, what is the situation in this situation. And therefore, law is always, the law that regime will create will always reflect that regime's understanding of it. And this is what Schmitt is basically saying here. That, in other words, it's going to be that these different things, the militaristic bureaucracy, a self-governing body controlled by the spirit of commercial, that's liberalism, right? Or a radical party organization. After all, every legal order is based on a decision. That's that whole point. Every legal order is based on a decision. And also the concept of the legal order, which is applied as something self-evident, contains within it the contrast of the two distinct elements of justice, the norm of the juristic, right? The juristic means that to make deciding of the law, how a law is or rule is decided, right? How the structure is decided, how is the norm and the decision, right? There's two concepts: the norm and the decision. The norm is what is the rule, is the principle, the thing like that. The decision is the question of what is to be decided, right? The act of the moment, the here and the now. Like every other order, the legal order rests on a decision and not on the norm. Okay, like every other order, the legal order rests on a decision. In other words, and that is tied. That's going to, again, I think what he means by this is that that of course the norm is going to be what is typical, but the decision is going to define the norm. That, I think, is what. Now, let's continue. Whether God is alone sovereign, that is, the one who acts as his acknowledged representative on earth, or the emperor, or the prince, or the people, meaning those who identify themselves directly with the people. The question is always aimed at the subject of sovereignty, at the application of the concept, to a concrete situation. This situation. Who has the authority to act? Who is the agent or the authority aspect of that? Who is legitimizing that power? Where does that? Who is the ultimate source of authority? And who gets to decide? Right. That's this question. Ever since the 17th century, jurists who discuss the question of sovereignty have derived their ideas from a catalog of determining decisive features of sovereignty that can be, in essence, traced to the points made by Baudin. To possess those powers meant to be the sovereign, okay, who had this power. In the murky legal conditions of old German Reich, the argument on public law ran as follows. Because one of the many indications of sovereignty was undoubtedly present, the other dubious interactions also had to be present. The controversy always centered on the question who assumed authority for concerning those matters for which there are no positive stipulations. For example, capitation. In other words, who is responsible for that for which competence has not been anticipated? In other words, what to do? In other words, there's no precedent. In other words, the rules and the structures have not anticipated who should decide, who should do this. Okay. In other words, the norm. In other words, it hasn't been spelled out. The routine has not. In other words, the whatever structure, the content, the custom. Go back to always the Weber's conceptions, the rational legal structures, and his second one, the concept of the custom, tradition, norm, or custom. Right, and the third, was charismatic. But the two routinizations of norms of tradition, custom, and then even rationality, legalism, they have not defined who is responsible for which competence has not been anticipated. In other words, who is competent to deal with this problem that we have not anticipated? If you have not anticipated the problem, because there cannot be a rule, cannot be a norm if you haven't anticipated it. Okay? The norm is something that we have foreseen and we know about, and that we have prepared for. There's a rule and decision that a norm has been set up and decides for this. But the problem here is that no. And remember that actual creation of the norm is a decision that was done, a decision about that situation, that thing. We foresaw it. We foresaw that decision, and we decided a norm rather than at the moment to come up with a new thing. We thought about it, right? But this is the problem of this German problem. Because of all this confusion of these traditions, controversy always centered on the question: who assumed authority concerning those matters for which there's no positive stipulations, right? And his example of this is, for example, capitulation, like surrendering, giving up. In other words, who is responsible for that which competence has not been anticipated, right? In a more familiar vein, it is asked, who is supposed to have unlimited power, right? Okay, this is that. Hence the discussion about the exception, right? In other words, the case of extreme necessity, right? This is the extreme necessitatis casus, the cause or case of extreme necessity. This is repeated with the same legal logical structure in the discussions of the so-called monarchical principle, right? This is in the discussion of the monarchical principle, this idea of the legal logical structure of this, but this extreme necessity. Here, too, it is always asked who is entitled to decide those actions for which the Constitution makes no provision. That is, who is competent to act when the legal system fails to answer the question of competence. The controversy concerning whether the individual German states were sovereign according to the Constitution of 1781 was a matter of minor political significance. So therefore, that's who was responsible, the Kaiser or the German 17? or the German states, right? Nevertheless, the thrust of the argument can easily be recognized once more. The pivotal point of Max Schneidl's attempt to prove that the individual states were sovereign had less to do with the question of whether the remaining rights of the individual states were or were not subsummable. It was summable means like this, but it was incorporated into, right. Were not be able to be subsumed, right. This is, I think, subsumable, right. That you weren't able to be subsumed. They were not able to be subsumed. Then, with the assertion that the competence of the Reich was circumscribed by the Constitution. In other words, which in principle meant limited, whereas the competence of the individual states was in principle unlimited. In other words, this was like, this question that he's trying to do was in other words, that the states, in other words, that whether the question remaining the rights of the individual states were or were not to be subsumed under the authority of the Reich, or was, but therefore that's why this question that the constitutional order sought to limit the competency of the Reich, right? In other words, that assertion that the competency of the Reich was circumscribed by the Constitution, which in principle meant limited, right? It was limited in that sense, whereas the competence of the individual states and of the states or the different institute states of the Reich were unlimited. I mean, now we can see this also in America. Look at during the COVID crisis of how the governors how were able to exercise extreme prerogative powers in various states. The various states of the unions, certain governors, particularly in blue Democratic states, used prerogative powers. Not this argument, oh, it's unconstitutional. No. The right of public, in other words, I hate to say it, in many ways, the states are still, okay, this is the double whammy of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment does put limits on states. The first, the thing of redefining that no state can deprive people of right, liberty, or pursuit or right, liberty of property without due process of law and the privilege of immunity. That whole clause in the first article of the definition of citizenship, and that whole clause would end the first and second clause, I think, of the 14th Amendment does fundamentally limit state sovereignty in ways that the original Constitution did not, but still, to many degrees, that the court has not been yet willing to go too far in that. I think the federal court has been a little bit unwilling to limit the discussion, because we could argue that the First Amendment protections, because of the 14th Amendment, extend through to the state governments now. And the First Amendment is not only about religion and speech; it's also about assembly, okay, and things like that, which could create a real can of worms. But the idea of in other words, prerogative power of state governors for this public health and public safety to exercise great authority. The state constitutions have long granted the governors those authorities, and that's why the governors always had the authority over the police. Usually had control over the police forces of the state and the militias, or that they still have control of the militias or the National Guard now, right? But there's almost a kind of a fear of doing that because of the scope of federal oversight and federal competence, right? So therefore, this idea here, right? In other words, that this is what he's talking to in the German case. He's talking in the German case of this question of the Weimar Constitution limited the Reich's power, but the states did not have a limit to this, and that therefore the states could exercise those authorities, do that because they were the ultimate source of authority, right? And individual states were not, their powers remained in them, right? Now he goes that this is a question again of Article 48 of the 1919 Constitution, which is the emergency clause, right? According to Article 48 of the German Constitution of 1919, Schmitt argues, the exception is declared by the President of the Reich, but it is under the control of Parliament, the Reichstag, which can at any time demand its suspension. This provision corresponds to the development and practices of the legal liberal constitutional state, which attempts to repress the question of sovereignty by a division or mutual control of competences. Right. In other words, the liberal constitutional order seeks to constrain sovereignty by limiting it through what? By what? Limiting it by a division of it's dividing it and giving mutual control of its competences to different bodies and different entities. But only the arrangement of the in other words, but only the arrangement of the precondition that governs the invocation of exceptional powers corresponds to the liberal constitutional tendency, not the context of Article 48. Article 48 grants unlimited powers. If applied without check, it would grant exceptional powers in the same way that Article 14 of the French Charter of 1815, which made the monarch sovereign. Right? This is the site. If this is Schmitt's legalism coming out here from this is constitutionalism, it's constitutional, legal constitutional. In other words, the Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution would its creation, but once it was targeted, the power was absolute. And applied without check, it would grant exceptional power to the same way Article 14 of the French Constitution made it the monarch sovereign. If the individual states no longer had the power to declare the exception, I'm sorry, these typos in this edition, I apologize. As the prevailing opinion of Article 48 at the time that he's writing, right, then they no longer enjoy the status of states. In other words, they are no longer states, they're subordinated units. Article 48 is the actual reference point of answering the question whether the German states are states. In other words, who decides who can actualize the emergency? If the German states themselves, the various states of Germany, cannot actualize the crisis within their territory to resolve the crisis, and it can only be addressed by Article 48 of the National Union, the federal constitution, then the states aren't states. This question of this idea of exceptional power, the use of exceptional to declare the exception in their territory, in their zones. If measures undertaken in an exception could be circumscribed by mutual control, by imposing a time limit, or finally, as in the liberal constitution procedure, governing a state of siege by enumerating extraordinary powers, the question of sovereignty would then be considered less significant, but would certainly not be eliminated. In other words, you can do this. You can create external procedures. You can define it. You can create enumerated entities, enumerated aspects. You would, in other words, the question of sovereignty would be less significant, but it would not be eliminated. What he says, a jurisprudence concerning the ordinary day-to-day questions has practically no interest in the concept of sovereignty. So in other words, the day-to-day ordinary things, this is not concerned with the sovereign. Only the recognizable is its normal concern. Everything else is a disturbance. Such a jurisprudence confronts the extreme case. Such a jurisprudence confronts the extreme case disconcertedly. For not every extraordinary measure, not every police emergency measure or emergency decree is necessarily an exception. In other words, these things can be routinized. These things can be routinized and things, and that therefore is not necessarily an exception. Now, and I think this is something that we have to understand. This is the real problem in the danger of our modern. The administrative state is not creating exceptions. The administrative state is routinizing what should have been something executed by the sovereign. They have taken over those things and routinized them to a great degree, and therefore it is given what norms. It establishes administrative norms and administrative things which has no the people have no oversight over. Okay, that's the danger of this, right? This is the danger of this aspect of here. But this is not exercising exceptionalism. I think this is what's really misunderstood. This is what I think the Claremontsters, the Claremont crowd, and their argument of administrative state doesn't really, in their recent enjoyment of things like of Agamben's theory of, oh my God, the crisis of this, Giorgio Agamben's view of exception, this kind of blurry Schmittian slash Agamben's blurring of Deleuze and Deleuze, Foucault, and Schmitt, which doesn't, which understands, misunderstands what Schmitt is talking about here, as in other words, the extra legal, extra structural, and and there's a distinction between the exception and things like where he says extraordinary measures or emergency decrees or emergency police things. In other words, not every one of these things is necessary an exception. What characterizes an exception is principally unlimited authority, which means the suspension of an entire existing order. That's the problem. The total throwing away of the existing legal order. In other words, this is like that. In such a situation, it is clear that the state remains, whereas the law recedes. So the state and the power of the state and the law recedes. Now, this might be the case. I think that this is where I think they are right in that. The administration is the law. In other words, the normal law. But administrative law replaces normal law. That's the problem. And therefore, and the problem with the Anglo-Saxon common law does not really have an understanding of. This is why Philip Hamburger's whole discussion of administrative law in the Anglo-American situation. Administrative law really doesn't work in common law frameworks. This works more in Roman law or civil law, European civil law models, Roman law, civil law models, which I think is a problem for a common law society. That's why Philip Hamburger's stuff on this is very important here. And this is where Schmitt is primarily a Roman lawyer. German law is Roman law in this sense. German law is very much framed by civil law constructs. So this is why he doesn't see this as a problem. This is why he might argue that administrative law is not an exception. It's within the norm, right? So therefore, in such a situation, it's clear that the state remains in state power, but whereas the law recedes, because the exception is different from anarchy and chaos. In other words, the exception is not anarchy and chaos. It is, in other words, it's simply just there is a situation where the law cannot solve the problem. Order of the juristic sense still prevails, even if not of the ordinary kind. In other words, the juristic means the decision of the state, right? Decision of the state body. A sense still prevails, even if not in the ordinary kind. The ordinary rules, the ordinary situation is not situation. In other words, there's an order here. There's an order still within the state. The state has an order. The problem here is not, it's anarchy and chaos is the state is dead. There's no state. There's no order at all. The existence of the state is an undoubted proof of its superiority over the validity of the legal norm. Okay, the state itself is superior to of its superiority over the validity of legal norm. The decision frees itself from all normative ties and becomes the true sense absolute. Now, this is his point about this. The deciding actor, the actor who is deciding, this is the thing who gets this, and this is absolute in that sense. And that this is what makes the norm, okay? And that's in his understanding. The state suspends the law in the exception on the basis of its right to self-preservation, as one would say. The two elements of the concept, legal order, are thus dissolved into two independent and therefore two independent notions, dissolved into two independent notions, and therefore testified to their conceptual independence, right? So therefore, the two elements of the concept of legal order. In other words, the right, and likewise, the normal situation when the autonomous moment of the decision resides to a minimum, right? The norm is destroyed in the exception. The exception remains, nevertheless, accessible to jurisprudence because both elements, the norm as well as the decision, remains within the framework of the juristic. By juristic is mean I think Schmitt's term here, juristic, means the concept by which decisions, the state instrument makes them, decides, right? The legal has the legislative or entity, the state actor rules, decrees, makes rules. So therefore, let's go look at this now. The existence of the state is undoubtedly proof of superiority of the validity of the legal norm, right? In other words, the validity of the legal norm is that whether, um, where is the source of the authority? It has the constitutional. The validity of a legal norm means has the authority, has the constitutional order or the legislature granted it, done it, right? In other words, whether this process, whether it has followed the process of, is it been authorized by the agent responsible who has competence for this, and and what has been said does it fit the limit given what the constitutional order or the political order grants it to be done, the competency and the question of competency and also limit of competency, right, is tied to that question. Now, the state suspends the law in the exception on the basis of its right to self-preservation, right? That's he says. And thus, the two elements of the concept of legal order, that is, the norm and the exception, he says. Now, remember, he's left out, he will expand this chapter, he will expand on it by arguing that it's not only two concepts, but third, that there's the norm, the exception, the norm and the norm, the norm and the decision and the other thing, administration, right? Or the institution, the institutional structure, that is being kind of the middle ground between the two things, right? That he said in the beginning introduction. In other words, the two elements of the legal order are dissolved into independent actions. So therefore, I testified to the conceptual independence of of this situation. Unlike the normal situation, when the autonomous moment of the decision recedes to a minimum. In other words, that the need to do this is not there. It's resolved. Things can work normally. In other words, in the normal situation, the what has been stipulated by law is working fine, and in other words, and that again, remember that what has been stipulated by norm has been established by a decision at one time, right? So a decision establishes the norm, and that the norm deals with the situation as and how things have been, in other words, we foresaw or we have prescribed how this situation should be. We looked at the situation, this condition, and prescribed what should be done. We saw and we prescribed, right? That this is this we have given the authorizing entity has prescribed certain things to be done. Now it has it has addressed this area clearly, stipulated what should be done, how it should be done, to what degree it's been done. It is foresaw. Now, when it hasn't foresaw, this is the exception. It's something that they could not have foreseen or did not or could not have foreseen. Now he says the exception remains accessible to jurisprudence because both elements, right, the norm and as well as decision, it always remains. It is part of the juristic concept. He says the norm and the exception, as well as the we have to remember the institutional framework, the third concept of law, is stuck within this that he mentions in the preface, the second edition, still is within the juristic. It would be a distortion of the schematic disjunction between sociology and jurisprudence if one were to say that the exception has no juristic significance and is therefore sociological. In other words, he says in other words, this is a concept. This is something that some people that the schematic distinction between these two, if it wanted to say the exception has no juristic significance, but sociological. The exception is that which cannot be subsumed. It defines the general codification, but it simultaneously reveals a specific juristic element, the decision in absolute purity. In other words, a decision that is a decision in this. By what he means here is the decision. A decision has been made. An actor is deciding. An actor with authority to act is deciding, is making a decision, what to be done, how it's to be done. And that's absolute purity, right? The exception appears in its absolute form when a situation in the legal prescription can be valid, must first be brought about. In other words, which a legal prescription, what the law must prescribe, that can't be, in which legal prescriptions can be valid, must first be brought about. Every general norm demands a normal, everyday frame of life to which it can be factually applied and which is subject to its regulations, right? The norm requires a homogeneous medium. Repeat this. Every general norm requires a normal, everyday frame of life to which it can be factually applied and which is subjected to its regulations. The norm requires a homogeneous medium. This effective normal situation is not merely a superficial presupposition that a jurist can ignore. That situation belongs precisely to its imminent validity. In other words, this situation of normal, this is the thing like this. There exists no norm that is applicable to chaos. Something in chaos means there's no order. There's nothing. The chaos is there's no frequency of order. Nothing that is normal. That should happen. That is happen, and therefore that we can rectify a situation of a law, right? For a legal order to make sense, a normal situation must exist. And he is sovereign who defines this, definitely decides whether this normal situation exists. In other words, does this situation exist or doesn't exist? Then if it exists, then the law applies. The law that he has authorized, or that he and his agency has authorized, should follow. But if it does not exist, then it cannot apply. All law is situational law. The sovereign produces and guarantees the situation in its totality. In other words, he produces and guarantees the situation. He has the monopoly over this last decision. This question of whether this is the norm or not. Is the situation normal or not? There resides the essence of state sovereignty, which is to be juristically defined. I think that's correctly. I think that's correct. That's a misspelling. Correct. See T. That's not D. Correct. LYTY. Defined correctly. Not as the monopoly to coerce or to rule, but as the monopoly to decide. I think this is his kind of slight criticism of Weber. Weber is the monopoly of force, from coercion, right? The state is monopoly of coercion. He says, no, coercion is an aspect of it's the monopoly to decide. This is his kind of correction of Weber right here, right? It is not heuristically defined correctly, not as the monopoly to coerce or to rule, but the monopoly to decide. The exception reveals most clearly the essence of state authority. The decision parts here, in other words, the decision parts here from the legal norm. And to formulate it paradoxically, authority proves that to produce law, it needs not be based on law. In other words, it does not have to be based on law. In other words, law is not based on law. Law is based on to produce law. It needs not be based on law. This is the paradoxical. The authority that proves that to produce law that it does not need. It needs not be based on law. The exception was something incommensurable to John Locke's doctrine of constitutional state and the rationalist 18th century. Now, I would disagree. I think there's something incommensurable to Locke's doctrine of the constitutional state. But wait a minute, I think he should know better, because the doctrine of prerogative power, in that he tries to regulate it and limit it, yes, but it's still there. The vivid awareness of the meaning of the exception that was reflected in the doctrine of natural law of the 17th century was soon lost in the 18th century, when a relatively lasting order was established. Emergency law was a no law at all for Kant. Now, this is Kant is the problem, right? Emergency law is no law at all for Kant. The contemporary theory of the state reveals the interesting spectacle of two tendencies facing one another: the rationalist tendency, which ignores the emergency, and the natural law tendency, which interested in the emergency and eliminates from its essential from an, the two tendencies, right? The first, the nationalist tendency, which ignores the emergency, and a natural law tendency, which is interested in the emergency and emanates from an essentially different set of ideas. Okay, right. So therefore, what that a neo-Kantian like Kelsen does not know what to do with the exception is obvious, but it should be of interest to the rationalist that the legal system itself can anticipate the exception and can suspend itself. That a norm, in order, that a norm or an order or a point of reference established itself appears plausible to the exponents of this kind of juristic rationalism. But how the systemic unity and order can suspend itself in a concrete case is difficult to construe, and yet remains a juristic problem as long as the exception is distinguishable from juristic chaos, from any kind of anarchy. In other words, if you understand that, in other words, the problem of this issue of this juristic problem, as long as the exception is distinguishable from juristic chaos or any other anarchy. In other words, you have to understand that anarchy is not the exception. Anarchy is no order. In other words, there exists an order where in other words, that to preserve itself and to maintain the order, the norm, there's no norm that has been established, no existing norm. That's the exception. Exception is not, it's not chaos in that sense. The tendency of liberal constitution was to regulate the exception as precisely as possible means, after all, the attempt to spell out in detail the case in which the law suspends itself. This is the problem with the liberal constitution. It tries to figure out every situation, right? But then what happens? It does. In other words, if you can't do what, in other words, you can only do what the law permits, and the law does not have a function to save itself, then you commit suicide, right? If you can't do it, in other words, you're not able to do unless the law has authorized, and the law has not authorized the situation, then you can't do anything. That's the problem with positivism, the positive law in that sense, as you can't do anything. The exception, the idea of the sovereign exercising exceptional power or prerogative power in the fundamental sense, is that this is what the rules have not, in other words, the law has not set up a situation. The public safety of the state is essential to it. Its life is maintaining, and therefore to preserve it, it exercises the right of self-defense, right? The right of this, that is inherent to the sovereign entity itself. That's the natural law argument, right? Hence, ends the sentence from where does the law obtain this force, and how it is logically possible that a norm is valid except from one concrete case that it cannot factually determine in any decisive manner? That's the question he's saying. That where does this law obtain its force? In other words, this logic. If you say that everything must be defined by law, but how can the law set up this thing that it does not know about? And how is it logically possible that a norm is valid except for one concrete case that it cannot faculty determine in any decisive manner? Right? It would be consequent rationalism consequence, rational consequence or something, to say that the exception proves nothing, and that only the normal can be the object of scientific interest. Right? This is that famous line: "The exception proves nothing. The exception confounds the unity and order of the rationalist scheme." In other words, the rationalist assumes everything must be normal. This is the scientific view. The scientific view assumes that you can't generalize something from a specific case. You can never generalize from a specific case. So therefore, something in a specific instant, you can't make the norm out of that. It's true. You can't make a norm out of that. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist and doesn't have import, particularly if it means the life and death of the state. In other words, the exception confounds the unity and order of the rational scheme. One encounters not infrequent a similar argument in the positive theory of the state. To the question of how to proceed in the absence of a budget law, Gerhard Ansfeld replied that this was not at all a legal question. There is not only a gap in the law, that is, in the text of the Constitution, but moreover in law as whole, which can in no way be filled by a juristic conceptual operation. Here is where the public law stops, or that famous thing of it. Precisely a philosophy of concrete life must not withdraw from the exception and the extreme case, but must be interested in it to the highest degree. The exception can be more important to it than the rule. In other words, question of life, right? The concrete life, the life itself, the lived life. The exception, the concrete rules. In other words, he's saying the exception can be more important to it than the rule, because not because of a romantic irony for the paradox, but because of the seriousness, of the insight that goes deeper than the clear generalization inferred from what ordinarily repeats itself. The exception is more interesting than the rule. The rule proves nothing. The exception proves everything. This is the opposite of the rational conception, right? It confirms not only the rule, but also its existence, which derives only from the exception. In the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of the mechanical that becomes torrid by repetition. Not torpid, torrid, T-R-I, torrid, I think, torrid, or boring, or kind of so routinized. It's a Protestant theologian who demonstrated the vital immensity, the intensity possible in theological reflection in the 19th century stated, "The exception explains the general and itself. And if one wants to study the general correctly, one only needs to look around for a true exception. It reveals everything more clearly than the general situation. Endless talk about the general becomes boring. There are exceptions. If they cannot be explained, then the general also cannot be explained." Again, this is Kierkegaard. I think this is right. I think he's referring to Kierkegaard here. He's right. Explained it. The difficulty is usually not noticed because the general is not thought about with passion, but with a comfortable superficiality. The exception, on the other hand, thinks the general with an intense passion. So he's not saying, the thing about this is that you don't. In other words, the argument tends to be that we can ignore the general is not really possible. We can't generalize these from things. The norm is what we generalize from, so therefore the norm is the real, and that the exception it's this thing that if the norm doesn't deal with it, it's beyond the scope of the law, right? This is where the law stops argument. This is the liberalism and the kind of neo-Kantian tradition, positivism of the neo-Kantian legal framework, and these are people like Hans Kelsen and those people. And Schmitt's mind is saying, nah, sorry. And he goes to Kierkegaard saying that it's not that, in other words, the exception explains the general in itself. And if one wants to study the general correctly, one needs to look around for a true exception, right? The real exception. Because why? Because it reveals everything more clearly than the general. The exception, extreme case, is going to get you a better understanding of this, he says, in a sense. If they cannot be explained, now if you cannot explain the exception, then you can't explain the general. And this is because the general, we don't, in other words, it's with the passion. In other words, the exception is something about this. The exception, on the other hand, thinks the general with an intense passion. The rule, in other words, there's something about this that the difficulty is not noticed because the general is not thought about with passion, but with a comfort with superficiality. We think about it so superficially. We don't look at the deeper workings inside. We see, oh, it's working. We're happy. Everything's working this way. We don't see that the maybe the antecedent conditions underneath another, or something that is essentially necessary, or is something is added into it that undoes what is normal. But we don't really have a full understanding. Only by this is what we see in social science, the importance of studying case studies. That we look at the atypical, or what we say the outlier cases. Why? Because we see the outlier cases where, okay, we see exactly why the norm doesn't happen. Why doesn't the situation do what is expected? And therefore something's missing. Something that we don't necessarily, we have not, in our understanding of the norm, we didn't understand. We didn't fully, completely understand. So therefore, the exception gives us a fuller understanding of the norm. Again, this is the thing about this. This is why decision, this idea that, oh, decision is something we don't deal with, but you did it. The decision made the norm, right? The norm and the decision are fundamentally connected. That clearly the decision is higher than the norm. The argument that the norm is higher than the decision only makes sense if another norm above it, a super norm, has, in other words, a super norm, but in other words, if you had the idea of the natural laws as that nature itself gave a law, but then wait a minute, there's a God who creates nature. So the God creates the law, who then that by which decision makers were under that authority, they make their laws, right? So therefore, this is why he calls this political theology, in the sense that there's always going to be a decider that is at the beginning of the process. Well, that's that. We finished this chapter. It's been a long one. I hope you will enjoy this gift. Take care, and you can, if you like what you put, any comments or questions in the thing below. If you like it, like it. If you didn't like it, say no, I don't want to like it. You can subscribe. If you're not subscribed, do subscribe. If you want to follow me on social media below, if you want to contribute to help me do this, you can go that. You can always buy my book in Lulu, but that's available down there to help me if you want to. If you don't want to be subscribed, start Patreon. So that's it. That's good. I hope you all enjoy this video, and take care. Bye bye.